There are a number of different input types in HTML, and HTML5 added a bunch of new ones as well. First, we're going to look at some of the ones we looked at in the previous video. The first type that we looked at is the type equals text, and this builds a text box just like we saw. As I mentioned before, you don't actually need to say type equals text. That is the default. The next type that we added previously is the type equals submit. And as you saw, this creates a little button that says submit. So when your customer fills out your web form, they can click on the button and submit the form. But what if you don't want it to say submit? What if you want it to say something else? You can change the value of that submit button by saying value and then whatever you want it to say. So I'm going to say click to submit form. Then the button changes to say click to submit form. Another input type that we have is the password type. You would enter that in the same way. Input type equals password. And then you give it an ID. And you preview it. And here's my password field. Now it looks exactly like every other text field on here except when you start typing. Oh, it's little dots. Can you tell what I typed? So that's a good way to hide the password. But bear in mind, the password field is still sending that password in clear text across the internet. So don't consider this a security measure for your passwords. It's still sending it in clear text. You want to actually encrypt your form data if you're sending passwords or something like that. And that's actually beyond the scope of this class. But this is a good way to hide the things that form fields are entering. And if it's a password that's really not that important, it's maybe for a game or something, you can use this password field and hide the text that people are inputting. Another input type you can have is instead of a submit button, you can have a button type, and it's not really all that different from the submit type, except that it doesn't have a default value. So if we left this value blank, the button would be blank. But as it stands, the button will still act like a submit button as long as there's a value. The other trick to the button type is that it won't automatically submit. So you have to have some kind of script assigned to it. But that's not the interesting stuff. The interesting stuff is the new HTML5 elements. HTML5 adds a bunch of new elements that actually make your forms more semantic, easier to fill out, and easier to validate. So for example, this first input type, my first name, that one's actually text. We just want them to submit text, so that one's fine. But email is a text that's in a specific format. And so there's actually an input type of email you can use to ask people to submit email addresses. Now when you preview it, the email address isn't going to look any different. However, if I were to type something like that, it's not actually an email address. And so the browser knows this. And so if there's some kind of validation set up, you can tell it, all I want is to validate, and it'll say, well, that's not an email address, so you have to go back. And it's built right into the actual HTML rather than having to do it with a script or a CGI on the back end. Another input type that you might have is the URL. So I'm going to copy the email type and paste it in here as only going to change it to URL. Because I'm asking somebody for their website address. So instead of type email or type text, we would type URL. And we want to change the placeholder message. And then when we preview it, now we have a URL. And this works the same way as the email address. If the form is validated, it'll validate that there's a URL in here and not just an email address. The one thing to keep in mind is that if your customers' browsers don't support HTML5 input types, it doesn't matter. These will still show up as text fields and they'll be able to submit the form. I realize that these password field's a little hard to read, so I'm going to add a label to it as well so we can see. And now there's a label for that password field. There's a bunch of other HTML5 fields that we can add, and they add values and make your input submissions clearer. So here are a few. So first I'm going to add a date field, and you do it the same way. You put in your input type, and you give it a type of date. And I gave it a placeholder with a date in it. You don't have to have a placeholder. The only thing you are required to have are the ID and then the type of date. And then when we save it and preview, as you can see, it doesn't really change how the field works. It's still going to request a date, but this will tell the browser that that's a date. Now I'm going to add another date field. This one's for time, and you use it to collect time values, such as 1 o'clock or whatever. And again, it's the same idea. You put in your ID, the type of time, and you can have a placeholder. Here I have it say 1:30 p.m. One thing to note is I've been using the same word time for my ID as the type time. You don't have to. This could be Joe, just as long as the 4 says Joe. This is the ID of the field. It doesn't have to match. They just happen to match in my example text. And again, when we preview it, the browser doesn't make any change to this value, but it will collect time data rather than just straight text. There are a couple other time and date fields that we could go into. They work the same. There's date time. That will collect a date and time value. There's date time local, -local. That's if you want to specify local time zones. That's getting into a lot more specifics than we really need to do. The ones that most people use are date and time. We'll add another one and add the number. The number field, it's obviously asking for a number. You can actually define what type of number you want using different attributes. So you can specify the minimum value for your number, min, and say we want the minimum value to be 0, and then you might want to say the maximum value. So you'd say max, and I'm going to say 0 to 10. So this would give a range of numbers. One thing to remember, however, is that they can say any number between 0 and 10, and it can be like 1.376. That is a number between 0 and 10. And here's where the browser actually changes, because it's actually giving you a step box. Because the default for CSS is to show integers when you choose a number. You can do other values, so I could say 5.5, but in terms of the default, it's going to default to integers. And here we have our 0 to 10, and it won't go any lower than 0, and it won't go any higher than 10. And that's up to the browser. Other browsers might just display a text field just like the time and the date. It depends on the browser, but it gives you a better way of requesting a number from a person. There's also another number option called the range. And the range, it's a less precise number. It's still a number, but it's less precise. You could do the min and maximum values if you want. It's easy to just see it. When you save the page and preview, you have this slider, so it's giving a range. Now, setting the min and max will send a value between that min and max, but this is a less precise range of numbers. So if you're just asking somebody to rate me on it, is it good or bad, they can put it, it's close to bad, or it's really, really good. And they can slide the slider around, and it'll send you a value related to where they put their slider on the screen. Again, some browsers don't support the range, and so they will just show a text field, but that's where you can put in parentheses 0 to 10, or whatever you want your range to be. Another input type from HTML5 that uses numbers is the telephone or tel input type. Here it's the TEL is your type, and that tells it that this is a telephone. I've put in a placeholder to make it look like a telephone number for people to view it. And so when this form is validated, it'll look at this field and look for telephone numbers because it knows that that's what should be submitted here. Then we have two fields left. We have a color field, and that is requesting a color, so you could ask for RGB or hex color or whatever. A lot of browsers will show a color input box, but not every browser does. For example, this one just shows a text box, but that's the advantage of HTML5 input fields. If the browser doesn't know what to do, doesn't have a color input box, then it just shows a text box and you can have them just type in their hex number here. But if it does know how to show a color input box, it'll show a color input box. So it's kind of like your pages become future enhanced. When the browser supports it, it'll work, but even if it doesn't support it, it still works. And the last type we're going to look at is the search field, and this is text that people want to search for. Some browsers will actually display this with like a little search icon or possibly more curvy edges. If you notice, if you compare the color box to the search box, for one thing, it doesn't change color when your mouse is in it. And for another, it's a little bit smaller and it's a little bit curvier. So it's trying to say that this is a search. If we then view this page in a browser like Safari, you'll see that it hasn't really changed because the preview is also using Safari, but we can also preview it in Chrome. And Chrome actually has the color input box. So I could actually choose a specific color and Chrome would submit that color value to the input. It would submit that color value to the form. And that's how you add HTML5 input elements to your web forms.